Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I know you're all now suddenly surprised by the arrival of our video stream. You've been very kindly waiting. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andrew Williams. I'll be hosting our inaugural Cyber Secure Schools event, powered and supported by Bitdefender. We're all about preventing digital crime here this afternoon, and we've got a whole host of what I hope will be really interesting and what I know are really interesting speakers lined up for you across the afternoon. What we're going to try and do is keep a fairly quick pace going with our presenters this afternoon. So I've given everybody about 10-minute slots, and we've got 6 of us all lined up ready to go. You are very, very welcome to ask questions at any time, and you can do that in the Q&A function on Teams Live. What we won't do is answer those questions immediately after the presenter. What we're going to do is hold all of those to a big Q&A panel session at the end. And in that panel session at the end, we're going to answer as many questions as we possibly can do and have maybe a little bit of a wider discussion around some of the security, cyber and information security challenges that we're seeing in the education sector at the moment. So if you do ask a question, one thing I'd very much appreciate you doing is just add the person's name who you want to ask that question to, or just add panel if you want to ask it to everybody. Now, Cyber Secure Schools is a brand new venture for us here at South West Grid. We're very experienced in delivering all kinds of different events here, but we haven't delivered one like this before. And what we're delighted to be able to do is to welcome, if you can get to that slide for me, Andy, a whole range of fantastic individuals. So you'll very shortly be hearing from a colleague here at Bitdefender, somebody from the ICSS at the University of Kent, and another one of our colleagues from Phoenix Software. We're very, very grateful to the support of Bitdefender in enabling us to host this event with all these fantastic people. Towards the end of the afternoon, we'll also hear, or the session, we'll also hear from our colleagues at myself. I'm going to do a slot, if you want to move on, Andy, and we're also going to get a slot from some colleagues at CySec Aware as well. So that's kind of the initial welcome. That's the handover. That's the big picture where we're going to go. As I say, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to ask those questions, and we will do our best to answer those at the end of the afternoon. We're also running a cybersecurity school survey. So if you do have a moment, or if you are drifting slightly with the presenters, I really hope you don't. But if you are, you can pop to tiny.cc/CS survey, capital CS and S. So tiny.cc/CSS survey, and you'll be able to get access to our Cyber Secure School survey. So the next thing for me to do is to introduce our first presenter. And I'm delighted to be joined by the magnificent Danny O'Neill from Bitdefender. Danny manages the MDR product set and is going to talk us through a little bit about what the landscape in education looks like. Danny, over to you.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I don't think I've ever been described as magnificent before, so thank you for that. But yeah, just by means of introduction, as Andrew said, Danny O'Neill. I am the Director of Global Managed Detection and Response Operations for Bitdefender. Which is an operation we've built out to do proactive monitoring, detection and response, as it says on the label, so to speak. But we're not necessarily here to talk about that too much today. It's more about talking about the landscape and what it means, particularly to the educational threat landscape, as it says there. I think what I would add, just as an introduction and a kind of segue into the discussion, is that traditionally, cybersecurity in particular is focused on securing the perimeter, and it was all about making sure that we built walls, we tried to stop attackers getting into the environment. And that philosophy doesn't go away. We still want to prevent as much as we can, and that's what our aim is to do. You first want to block and prevent attackers getting into the environment. But there has to be an acceptance in the modern threat landscape that something could get through. And how I like to always phrase this is, it's not an acceptance of defeat, it's just acknowledging reality. And the important thing is that, as well as putting all those good controls and measures and technologies in place to prevent as much as we can, you also have to have something beyond that that is monitoring, detecting and responding rapidly, because what you want to do is minimize the impact if something does get through those perimeter defenses. And I think that's a very important aspect of modern cybersecurity, as opposed to the more traditional approach of, set and forget, put the technology in place, and we're all good until the technology tells us there's something wrong. That's not how we approach it, and it's not how anyone should be approaching security these days, in my opinion, and I can speak on behalf of Bitdefender on that. So that's just an introduction. Next slide, please, Andy. Okay, go back to the previous one. Yeah, so I'll talk to this, the education threat landscape. What can happen, what can you do about it, and what do we see? It goes without saying that over the past 18 months to 2 years, the amount of ransomware attacks have increased heavily, and that's what we see a lot of. That's what a lot of our incidents involve. The education sector in particular, that kind of provides a vertical for threat actors to gain access to sensitive information, intellectual property, in particular research information, if you're talking universities or colleges, to kind of US phrase. So, and it's not just about being targeted directly, it's also about being used as I don't know, this is a cyber phrase, but I mean it in the traditional sense, a Trojan horse. So the education establishments being used as something that will be used as their suppliers will be used as a vector to get into those environments. Not educational related, but those who are aware, the target, the big US supermarket chain, they were targeted, they were successfully hacked and attacked, and it came through their air conditioning supplier, who didn't have good security, target themselves, didn't have their environment locked down or segmented. So once the attacker got through via the air conditioning supplier, they were in, and they had access to the full environment. So it's not just about being targeted directly, it's the indirect attacks that can also hurt. I would say, yeah, this would include the targeting of business communication. I've mentioned already research, looking to pivot around and find relationships, and most importantly in the education sector, just as with the health sector, and really any other environment, access to personal information, financial information, anything that could be of use to an attacker, particularly, like I say, when we're talking ransomware attacks where they're going to lock down the environment and demand payment to unlock it. So, okay, next slide, and then go again, Andy. So, and again. So just what we've seen. Yeah, we've seen an example of a school district. This was US based, but that matters not. It could be anywhere in the globe. Yeah, they're doing kind of random searches on open source intelligence and around the dark web, seeing email database dumps of email addresses, probably associated with third-party websites, but the risk of password sharing could be involved in that as well. And in this particular example, which clearly I'm not going to allude to who it was, but there were over 100 user credentials leaked over a 6-month period. But that goes back to being proactive, accepting that things happen, using threat intelligence, using proactive monitoring to search for things, find them quickly, and contain and isolate them before there's impact, as opposed to blindly sitting there thinking that everything's okay. Education is a prime target for cyber criminals. We've mentioned it already due to there's a lot of valuable information stored on school networks, on endpoints, and it's not just the personal information. It could be research, it could be valuable intellectual property that's available. So it's a, from an attacker's perspective, quite a kind of lucrative market, so to speak. Attacks we've seen in the last 12 months, I've mentioned already, they have predominantly been ransomware. I could list different types. I've put a few there already. But most important, that third bullet point there, it's important to recognise, and I'll call this out at the end, a lot of the attacks we see are still targeted phishing attacks. Regardless of how we talk about how sophisticated attackers are becoming, and they are, regardless of the capabilities they are using becoming more capable, they are, that's still the main way into an environment. The unsuspecting user clicking on the wrong link because it looks normal, but that in itself is quite sophisticated, because attackers are getting better at making things look normal. But we'll touch on it at the end again. And yeah, I'd probably just jump to the last point there. Hacktivists, looking to disrupt activities, and this goes back more to the research area of education and development. Something they might not disagree, they might not agree with, something they want to disrupt because it's not something they like. It could be a protest. But that's something the education sector, particularly the universities and the colleges who are researching and developing and looking at new initiatives and innovation, need to be aware of, because that could make them a target. Next slide, please. Okay, what can we do about it? I mentioned before about phishing attacks. Still, and I would say probably 60 to 70% of successful ins into an environment are through a phishing attack. Education, ironically, given the nature of the audience here, staff training and awareness, you can't place enough emphasis on that. Absolutely. Show them what to look out for. Make sure people are checking the URLs, make sure people are checking the email address that's been sent to them. What does that link look like? We can put all the technology in place as much as we want, but if someone clicks, then at the end of the day, the system will just think it's a legitimate user clicking on something they want to see, and it could be malicious. This is a big one for me. I've put their comprehensive security and compliance plan baked into the organisation's strategy and culture. That's like a soundbite, but it's absolutely important, because cybersecurity can't be an afterthought. If there's a project, if there's a new capability being brought in, and I know we all talk a good game at this, but cybersecurity should be built into that from the onset. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should, cybersecurity, gone are the days, in my opinion, where cybersecurity was this, the police that sat in the corner and told the organisation what it couldn't do. It's not. It's there to enable the business. It's there to enable the organisation. But to do so, it needs to be involved in the projects from the start, from the onset. So it's very important that it's involved in these things from the start. Not, hey, we've implemented this new thing. how do we secure it? Because then you're playing catch up, okay, after that. And then really, and this is probably I promise not to go salesy, and I won't, but in terms of what we do at Bitdefender and other companies do as well, you know, what can you do about it? How can you solve for it? It goes back to what I'm saying, you know, be proactive. Don't have the traditional security mindset of compliance, controls, putting technology in place and waiting for that technology to alert and tell you something is wrong. Do those things because we have to. But an analogy I use is that if you make yourself compliant, you will be compliant, but you won't be secure. If you focus on being secure, you'll make your environment secure, and by default, as a byproduct, you will be compliant. But in the kind of modern threat landscape, and particularly with particular emphasis on the education environment, you know, it's important to be proactive. Like I said earlier, don't think of accepting defeat. Just acknowledge that some things will get through. They will circumnavigate the technology and the controls you have in place, but have the ability to, and I'll read this through now, and I don't like to read off bullets, but I will, detect rapidly, respond immediately, contain it quickly and isolate it, and then you're minimizing the impact, as opposed to the alternative of sat there blissfully thinking everything's okay when an attack has actually been in the environment for several months without you knowing. And I will end there, Andrew. I don't know how I'm doing for time there.
That's brilliant, Danny. A little bit over, but that's absolutely fine, and really interesting just to kind of hear from your perspective in the industry about some of the threats and the landscape and the environment that I guess schools are operating in a much wider sense. You know, we're not just these little bubbles of school and education, and we're connected to the internet, we're connected to all those risks, opportunities and threat actors out there. So it's really good to get that perspective on that, Danny. And we will come back to you, hopefully at the end, with some questions. Again, I'm just going to encourage anybody in the audience. I know there's loads of you in the audience. In fact, if you want to write a question in the Q&A section, by all means do. Add the person's name who you want to direct the question to if it's a specific question, or add the word panel at the front if you want to ask it to the panel. Danny, thanks ever so much. We will come back to you, as I say, at the end, but we're going to move on now, if I may, to Virginia. Virginia joins us as Deputy Director of the Institute of Cybersecurity for Society at the University of Kent, and you can see her fantastic backdrop behind her on her video there. I know, however, that is not the view out of her window right now, but wouldn't that be a lovely way to spend your day looking out the window at Canterbury Cathedral? So she's going to talk to us a little bit here around the cybersecurity skills development in education sectors before young people get to university, and give us a real kind of sense about where her research project, GFCE, and she'll introduce herself in that in a minute, is looking at that type of skills development and the global nature of that. So I'll pass over to you, Virginia.
Hello, thank you, Andrew. So welcome. So this in this talk, we are going to talk about preliminary findings about an ongoing project that is funded by the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise based in the Netherlands, and which is conducted by us, a group of us at the University of Kent. Can you move to the next slide, please? Right, okay, so I would like to start with what I think are interesting stats just published in April by the Ofcom regulator on the media use and attitudes report. And one thing that strikes is that 82% of children as young as 3 or 4 years old are actually actively using resources online. Another thing that is I found particularly interesting is that the social media used by people below 13, so not reaching 13 yet, is 42%. So there is a lot of children as young as 5 using social media, and the social media, the most popular are Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and by definition on their terms and conditions, these platforms advertise that the minimum age to use the platforms are 13. So it's very popular for children actually not in the correct age band to use it. Next slide, please. So parents, also in this report, parents recognize and are concerned about different risks of the children being online, and might be from access to content, for example, inappropriate content, or might be content that leads to radicalization, or content that encourage self-harm, up to things that their children are generating themselves, so content generated by the children, and also data, their personal data. So things like they post online that might compromise their future in terms of reputation, in terms of career, etc. in the future. Sharing content with strangers, and the use of their data by companies, for example, for profiling these children, etc. Parents also recognize cyberbullying and pressure in terms of spending money, so gambling and things related to marketing, and excessive time online. So the thing is that we need to empower children with skills for them to actually be critical about those risks and realize them and deal with them and protect themselves, right? So next slide, please. So education. So it leads us to cybersecurity education for pre-university children. So what we did was, in this project, a part of it is we looked at how the UK, countries in the UK, and all the 5 countries, English-speaking countries, actually are covering cybersecurity skills, are embedding cybersecurity skills in their curricula. So starting from the UK, next slide, please. So so for example, England. So if we look at England, we have a national curriculum, although academies are not bound by this curricula, but this curriculum embeds digital literacy within the computing subject. So this is where the cybersecurity content, online safety content is actually addressed. In Wales, on the other hand, although they have a national curriculum, that they don't the national curriculum doesn't incorporate cybersecurity. So cybersecurity aspects are covered are part of the area of citizenship. So I covered as citizenship, according to what they called the Digital Competence Framework, which is not mandatory. It's just a guideline to help teachers to cover concepts related to cybersecurity and online safety. For example, it covers identity, digital rights, and online behavior. Scotland has the Curriculum for Excellence, which embeds digital literacy as well, under ICT, so under technologies, and it goes over concepts related to cyber resilience and internet safety in their curriculum, while Northern Ireland takes a different approach, a slightly different approach. So they cover cybersecurity in the national curricula under across curricular skill sets embedded within using ICT, so across different subjects. So they it includes, for example, how to keep safe and how to have acceptable behavior online. Next slide, please. Right. So if we look at the 4 countries in the UK collectively, So this table shows the grid, the age grid across the different countries. There's the 4 countries. So one thing that we notice is that apart from, so England covers mandatory cybersecurity skills and online safety up to the age of 14, while Scotland covers, it starts at very early stage, pre-university, pre-mandatory university. So all countries start mandatory school at 5. Scotland aims to introduce cyber safety at preschool, so nursery level at the age of 4, going over up to 15, and Northern Ireland going to 16. So England covers in cybersecurity skills under computing, Scotland under ICT, and as I mentioned before, Northern Ireland across subjects, while Wales is covering cybersecurity as citizenship. Next slide, please. Right, so we looked at 5 other countries, as I said before. One of the countries that we looked at is the US. So the US is a federal country. It has no national curriculum that covers, that is adopted across all the states, but the approach that they have is that they have the K-12 computer science framework. So this framework informs or aims to inform the state level curriculum, the development of the curriculum for by different states. So they have 5, this framework has 5 core concepts. One of them is network and internet, and it covers cybersecurity skills, technical skills. And then it has another concept, which is impacts of computing, that covers safety law and ethics. Australia has a national curriculum for ICT technologies, and it covers cybersecurity under what is called curriculum connection online safety. So in this aspect, Australia covers cybersecurity across different subjects, and the curriculum is under review and aiming to introduce cybersecurity for very young people, 4 and 5. Canada has a very similar approach to the US. So instead of having a national curriculum, again, they're a federal country, they have what is called a pan-Canadian K-12 computer science education framework. Actually, this is being designed as we speak. So it's not yet published and enforced. So this aims to make the capacity building for preschool children kind of consistent across the whole country, across provinces. So again, they have this very similar to US approach. So they have what they call focus area. One of the focus areas is computing and networks, and cybersecurity skills are built into this. And they have a technology and society focus area, which covers ethics, safety, the law, so the safety online stuff. Next slide, please. We also looked at Singapore and New Zealand. So Singapore has a very different approach. So they have a mandatory curriculum for character and citizenship, and they cover cyber security skills within it. So they approach things like what they call cyber wellness, online safety, and responsibilities of ICT users. New Zealand has a national curriculum that has ICT, and under ICT there is one focus area which is called designing and developing digital outcomes, where security and privacy is built in terms of building outcomes. So devices, software, data, this kind of stuff is the approach for New Zealand. Next slide, please. So if we look at these 5 countries collectively, so we have seen the US and Canada cover cybersecurity under computer science. Australia covers across subjects, and Singapore in character citizenship, and New Zealand ICT. What we see collectively here is that the start mandatory school age is 6, and they cover cybersecurity very up to the late stages, up to 18 usually. And Australia and Canada are aiming to introduce cybersecurity before that. Next slide, please. Right, so in conclusion, the majority of the countries that we looked at, 9 countries, incorporate cybersecurity content either in ICT, computing, and computer science subjects, while some of them, Northern Ireland and Australia, cover it across subjects. We have identified that different levels of coverage, so a lighter coverage and a deeper coverage, which seems to be a lighter coverage being adopted by Wales, Singapore, and New Zealand, and a deeper approach being adopted by Australia, Canada, US, England, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. Another conclusion is that Scotland, Canada, and Australia are targeting very young children at the age of 4 and 5. Next slide, please. Right, so just to remind again about the cybersecurity school survey that has 3 parts. I'm not going to talk too much because Andrew is already saying that I am much over. Right, so this is organized by the 3 entities, so SWGfL, us at the University of Kent, and Bitdefender. So this is the link again. Next slide, please. And please stay tuned if you are interested, because we are looking at other countries as well. So more, I think 7 countries, different, not only English speaking. So with the same intention to see how they cover cybersecurity skills in their curriculum. Next slide, please. And that's it. So the project team is there, and if you have questions, not only at the end, you can always email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Really appreciate that. It's really hard. I did set a very hard task in asking everyone to stick to 10 minutes. And, I'm going to find out if I can do that in a minute as well. Thanks to for highlighting the survey again for us. It's important to recognise and reflect on the fact that University of Kent, Virginia herself, are contributing to that survey, and we really hope that you can find just 10 or 15 minutes time to go and have a look at that survey, complete it, and if you'd like to at the end, you can put your name down, email address down, to get access to 5 complimentary licenses for Bitdefender software for use at home. So that research is interesting. Again, if you have questions on that, then we can cover those at the end. Drop them in at any point in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up. I've already got a few written down here I'd like to ask in due course. And what happens now is, rather awkwardly as the host, it flicks to me to actually deliver a little session. So Andy, thank you very much. I was going to try and talk this through a little bit. I'm going to try and hit the time framing on this as well. So I'm going to put my timer on and see how I do. So when you think of hackers, when you think of cyber, do you think of the hooded hacker, or do you think of the call center? And which one of those 2 entities scares you more? Is it the notion of the hacker bent over the keyboard, hunched over the keyboard late at night, or is it these cell block like cubes that we see around offices in the UK? And now, thinking that you're worried about the hacker, you're wrong. What you need to be worried about are those people in all those cube farms, as they're called, where you have countless cubes in large-scale offices. They're the ones using social engineering and phishing techniques to try and get access into your data. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about user behavior, and we're talking at this stage about helping you as schools and other educational organizations understand that the risk is out there. So if you look at some of the news stories that we've seen over the last few months and years, You can see, Andy, that there's a whole range of attacks that have taken place, attacking all kinds of different educational establishments and all kinds of different groups and bodies, flagging up the fact that this is a growing risk. This isn't something that's just suddenly appeared. You know, over the last 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, we've seen a steady growth in ransomware attacks. And those ransomware attacks are occurring regularly. I was just in contact the other week with a local authority representative who was telling me that just that week they'd had 2 schools hit by ransomware attacks. So if you're not ready for this environment, then you're simply exposing yourself to that risk. And when you expose yourself to the risk of ransomware, the implications for that are quite vast. And if we move on to the next slide, I can look at some of the reasons why those are vast. And I want to look at this from a safeguarding perspective, because what we tend to do is just think of the hack itself. But actually, hacks have an impact on our ability to access data. And one of the ways they do that is they might take out database records. And those database records, for example, could be parental contact details, pupil records, third-party contact details. Now, if you can't access those database records, can you operate your school safely? Now, you might have a paper copy. You might have an access to something else, but actually it's about the ability for you to quickly respond to that threat and to quickly ensure that you're able to continue offering the educational services you provide. You know, the risks are different depending whether you're maintained, academy, independent, whether you're coming from this from a college or a tertiary sector, you know, or higher education. The risks are different in terms of how that operates, but fundamentally, you know, breaching confidentiality, integrity, or accessibility means you can't provide your services. When it comes to the type of systems that are controlled by computers, so what we tend to forget about are those things that are operated on our network infrastructure. So things like CCTV systems, email systems, telephone systems. You know, what's the implication if you have your system's taken down and you can no longer access your CCTV or door access? Then there's the actual information that you're trying to access. So the safeguarding implications are about, can you operate your school without the internet? Question mark. What about file servers? What about remote access systems? So, you know, all of those are implications from a safeguarding perspective. But like, as Danny alluded to earlier, what's the implications for you or your staff or your pupils if you then lose that data onto the dark web? And we know this happens. We know from case studies, we know from those stories I've just pointed to earlier, that information can be harvested as part of a ransomware attack. It can be collected, saved, stored, and then monetized through the dark web. And that's a really stark risk and a stark warning for us as educators, is actually, as a senior leader, as a head teacher, as the operator, owner, whatever the term is for you, managing a school, it's the value of that data if you lose it. It's the reputational damage that it can have. It's the safeguarding implications that are an absolute clear-cut lever for why you could and should be developing and looking at your systems more in terms of protecting. So what does that look like? Okay, let's look at the layers of protection. Now, this is a historic, classic cybersecurity diagram. You start with your core data assets at the center of this diagram. And what that means is, do you know where your stuff is? Do you know where your critical data is? Can you ensure you've got that confidentiality of data? Once you know where your stuff is, you can then start looking at the security around that data. So the next layer is, okay, well, what we've got policies, we've got critical data maps, if we've got retention and disposal policies. You add another layer on top of this, application security. The applications that you're using to access that data, are they secure? Have you got patching in place? So do you keep them up to date automatically? Have you got access control systems in terms of who can access what information using what software? Have you got password security policies in place? So once you've got your application secure, you know your data secure, you know what the data is, you're then looking at the endpoint. Now, endpoint is a newish term. Basically, what that means is a device that you're using. When it comes to devices, you want the device that the software is running on to be secure as well. There's no point running secure software if your device is insecure. So that's things like anti-ransomware, antivirus, the exploit pretensions, the fileless attack pretensions, and asset management. Do you know which devices you've got, who's got them, how up to date they are, when you've last seen them? Are you tracking all of that? And then there's the last two layers, just sort of merged together, but they are slightly different. You've got your perimeter security and you've got your network security. And what that's talking about is your firewalls, your ISPs, your filtering and monitoring systems, and your intrusion detection systems. And what I've tried to do with this diagram is kind of categorize them a little bit, because one of the things I want to point out is that, yes, some of this is techie, but all of those pink items are systems that are policy or people led. They are systems that senior leadership teams can absolutely influence, and key to that are quite central in that diagram. Lots of the pink sits in the middle of that. But underneath all of that, as Danny has already mentioned, underpinning all of this work is staff training that happens at all levels and doesn't exclude caretakers, support staff, senior leadership team and administrators. Getting all those layers of protection right means that you're more able to protect your resources, you're more able to protect your core critical data assets because you know what they are, and then you've got layers of protection around it. It is exactly the same thing in a different way about protecting the kids at the school. If you have children in the school, you have layers of protection around the kids to keep them safe from attack. You have perimeter security, gates, you have door security, you have staff security, you have processes and policies in place for lockdowns. So all of those layers you apply to kids, and what we need to do is apply that to kids and staff data too, to make sure that we're keeping that safe. It's just as important as the physical security is. So top key things that we're talking about here, three key threats, Andy, are insider threats, ransomware and phishing. Now, if you look across all of those are some interesting ideas that you can try and implement yourself if you haven't got them in place already. Data loss prevention, audit identifying your core data, backups are in place, which Poppy will talk about in a minute. You've got software protections, and you've got that responding quickly that Danny alluded to as well. And across all of those are the need for training. Now, training doesn't have to mean sat down, bum on chair in a training room, listening to somebody like me droning on from a PowerPoint protection. That's part of it, absolutely. But it doesn't just have to be that. It can be short, sharp, little bursts of information. It can be something you flag up in a staff meeting. And that training is all about building awareness. And Andy and Jez, a little bit later on from CySec Aware, will do a little bit about explaining to you how that, what that might look like and how that might work. And actually, awareness can operate really effectively from a point of view of looking at the individual. So how do we protect our own stuff? If we don't protect our own stuff very well, well, actually, we're unlikely to protect the organizational stuff very well. And a key example of that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, are passwords and the way in which particularly school staff members manage their passwords. There's been a bone of contention for many, many years for any IT professional is the reusing and the simplification of passwords. And we've got to get to a point now where we're using 12 or more character passwords made up of 4 random words you throw together to generate your password. They're called passphrases rather than passwords. And that's a much stronger way of beginning to protect all of our stuff. That and using password vaults or managers. So alongside the key approach, Andy, of staff training, you also do have to have a little bit of awareness around this with your staff members, looking particularly around passwords and getting the organizational layers correct so that all your layers are layering up around your key data that you've identified, that you know where it is, and that is helping keep your core data assets in your school safe. Now, I think I've outstanded and amazed myself in bringing that in at almost exactly 10 minutes. If any of you have ever seen me present before, you will know that that is nothing short of a small miracle. I hope that's just given you a little insight. And that's what we wanted to do this afternoon, is give you 6 different perspectives, lots of little thoughts and lots of little ideas and lots of little presentations to give you an overview and a get-going set of information. What we didn't want to do is try and lay out all these bunch of scary things that means that you all kind of want to bury your head in the sand, because that's not helpful. As Danny says, this stuff is going to happen. This stuff is out there all the time, and what we need to do is be prepared and ready for that. And that's what Poppy is going to do next as well. Poppy's going to do a great little overview across good backup routines. Now, before she starts, I'm just going to say thank you very much. I can see questions coming in, and we will pick up on those questions in due course. But thanks ever so much for asking those. Just hang on for answers. Now, Poppy works for our partners at Phoenix Security. She is a data protection specialist at Phoenix Software. I'm sorry, not security. We've worked alongside Phoenix for about 10 years or so, and Poppy is an absolute genius when it comes to talking about backup, Poppy.
Crikey, yeah, Danny, you're right, he's definitely overselling us here, I think, isn't he? So I'm going to try and speak quite slowly, so bear with me, because you guys down in the Southwest probably don't hear somebody as northern as I am very often. So I'm gonna try and be as calm as I can be, but it's lovely to meet you all. And I'm sure in my time at Phoenix, I may have already spoken with a couple of you before. So yes, Andrew is absolutely right. My role at Phoenix is all things backup, disaster recovery, business continuity, data protection. And as everybody is aware, all of you are aware, it isn't the sexiest of subjects. We all have to have a backup, or I would like to think you all have a backup anyway. And in some cases, we stretch to disaster recovery. And I think the main thing that I want you to take away from today is, and the reason why we're on this event, because as Andrew rightly pointed out, backup isn't a separate silo to cybersecurity. They absolutely work hand in hand. So we need to very quickly diminish the idea that backup and disaster recovery is a separate entity entirely, because it isn't. You should be considering them hand in hand. Now, backup routines are very much there for a worst case scenario, right? You don't implement a backup solution in the hopes that you never have to use it. I mean, you hope you don't, especially on a mass scale, but it's always something that you have there to be able to rely on. So Andy, could I go to the next slide, please? So essentially, I'm going to walk you through a number of my best practice tips. And now this comes from across the whole of public sector, because Phoenix only deal with public sector, so education, charities and housing, and public sector as a whole. But I've tried to keep them as education as specific as I can, especially to schools, because I know you guys traditionally are on the worst end of budgets, and you have to stretch resources as fast as far as you can. So Andy, could I get the first bullet point, please? So this is probably, and if you're going to listen to anything I have to say, the most important one, because if you're neglecting to test your backup and your restores, you are going to be in hot bother if something happens and you haven't, and they fail, essentially. So I think the main thing that I can say to you is at least once a week, you need to be testing that you can successfully back up all workloads. So not just a random data point that's sat on a server somewhere that's cold and you've not used it for a very long time. It's all good and well testing that backup. You need to be testing the backup of something critical. Now, that's obviously entirely dependent on your organisation, but not just testing that the backup is successful, testing that you can restore it as well. The restore is arguably the most important part. Don't do this on a Sunday. Don't do it at 7:30 on a Wednesday evening. You need to be doing this during business critical time, because what you need to do is you need to calculate your RTO and your RPO. Now, I know they're buzzwords and a lot of you have probably heard about them. They've been around for a very long time. Your recovery time objective is essentially the length of time your business can go without having that data. So if all of your data is gone, what is the length of time that your business can survive without it? Now, if for some people that might be a week, in a dream world, that would be a week. You've got a week to get everything back. Realistically speaking, how quickly can you survive without SIMs or something like that? Something that's very, very critical to the function of your school. You need to be testing that backup and that restore, because if it comes to it and you've been testing something that's fundamentally not important, but it's been working, but your most critical data can't be restored, you've been doing it for nothing. Your recovery point objective is how long you can survive without that data, essentially. So not the time, it's the data itself. So you need to sort of classify in, I try and put it into 3 brackets if I can. So business critical, cannot survive without it for even 5 minutes. Mid-level, that could be stuff like finance, you could maybe go a day without it. And then you've got stuff that sits in the background, so maybe previous students' data that isn't as critical, it could take a little bit more time to come back. So the most important thing is calculating your RTO and RPO and sticking to it. Review it once every month, every 3 months maximum, because it changes all the time. We generate huge amounts of data every single day, and with that the critical data changes, so you need to be checking that all the time. But also the testing of your backup and restores, that is 100% the most important thing that you can be doing, and you do it for free. You don't have to spend any money doing it, unless it fails, of course, then you might need to spend some money. Next point, please. So the NCSC guidelines, very, very loosely, is the 3-2-1 rule. Very basic. A lot of you will probably be doing it already, and if you're not, it's something that they do very much encourage. It's 3 copies of data, 2 devices, and 1 of those off-site. So you would a backup traditionally is 1 secondary copy of the primary point of data. So the NCSC asks you to go 1 step further and have a 3rd copy. So your backup data on disk on the same site as the primary data may be your 1st copy. Your 2nd copy could be up in the cloud. It could be a 2nd school. It could be something, you know, entirely different tape or something like that. They want 2 devices. Very, very, you understand what that means, and they want 1 of them to be off-site. So as I just mentioned, that's the disaster recovery element. So although disaster recovery in previously meant things like fire damage, flood damage, and although that's still incredibly prevalent as a disaster recovery reason why you would need a DR, nowadays we're talking cyber threats. So if something impacts your 1st site, your primary site, in a cyber sense, you need to have somewhere entirely off-site for disaster recovery purposes. Now the NCSC do go 1 step further, so there's a 4th step, if you like. So it's a 3-2-1 plus 1, and that's an offline or a mutable backup. So that's not to say you have to do it, but in the current threat landscape, as everybody is very rightly so touched upon on this call so far, cyber criminals are going to hit you where it hurts, right? And the first thing that they're going to do is try and encrypt or damage or delete your backup data, because if you've got a ransom to pay, they want to make sure you pay it because they want the money at the end of the day. And one way that they can almost guarantee that is wiping out your only way to recover. So that's your backup. Now, an immutable backup, and I'm sure a lot of you are looking into this already, because I know some of the cybersecurity insurance that a lot of you have, especially in education after the past year, are mandating it now, is essentially a copy of data that cannot in any way be encrypted, modified, changed, deleted, overwritten in any way. The second it's created is the way that it stays forevermore. You cannot change it at all. So you can understand why the NCSC is asking people to have that. So very, very important to look at. You actually, some of you, if you're running things like Veeam and stuff, the latest update will already have that capability, so you don't even need to pay more for it. Next point, please. Consider a cloud backup. Now, this also follows on from the NCSC guidelines, because this can achieve that offline backup if you hold it in cold storage. Cloud backup essentially is an actual physical separation from your primary data site. It's very, very quick. It can come in a number of different ways to tier it. So you could have it in hot storage. If we're talking Azure, you can have it in hot storage. It comes back very quickly. You pay a bit more for it. Cool, which is classed as offline. A little bit less expensive, but your restore time is a little bit longer. So any very, very business critical data, you probably wouldn't want it in there. And you can also get archive within the cloud, which is, as it says on the tin, stuff that you don't need to access very often or at all, but you pay a little bit less for that. Next one, please. So following on from this, you guys, I know you like to sweat your assets, and rightly so as well. You've made an investment, right? You need to make sure that that money that you pay up front for 3 years, 5 years is still doing everything that it needs to do. And if you're running software or even hardware as well, you need to ensure that you are updating to the most recent update, likely every single year. So vendors typically update every firmware and just updates their software every 12 months. Now, some of them are just very, very basic updates. It might be to the user face. It might be something very, very menial. Some of the bigger updates in the past 12 months and in the coming 12 months are going to be around immutability capabilities. So you need to be ensuring that the software, hardware, services, anything that you're running are up to date, because you're not going to be getting the most out of your purchase if you're not running an up-to-date version. Next step. I've already mentioned immutability, but it deserves its own bullet point. I think the key thing that I don't want you to be worried about is that you have to pay an arm and a leg for immutability, because you don't. So there's 2 ways that you can achieve immutability, very, very simplistically. You can buy a solution that has immutability already built into it. So we're talking Rubrik, we're talking ArcServe, we're talking Commvault, or you can just get an immutable backup target. So you may just have a server racked somewhere in your primary site, and that's your backup target. You can do things like harden Linux repositories to make them immutable. So any backup copy that you send to that target is then immutable. Now, I know it can get quite complicated, and I don't want any of you to be worried, because it is very, very simple to achieve. Phoenix are here. I'm here to be able to help you do that if you need help. It's the most simple way to achieve immutability is through cloud. AWS S3 buckets are immutable as standard, and Azure also have an answer to that as well. Next one. Yes, so parallel running, I mentioned it in the beginning. Whenever you review your cybersecurity, you need to review your disaster recovery and your backup as well. Anything that you have in place to impact cybersecurity is going to probably impact your backup and disaster recovery. If you're speaking to people at Phoenix, the likes of Bitdefender, etc., we'll make sure that we talk together internally. So if you're talking to somebody at Phoenix, they're going to talk to me about it. But consider it as part of a wider cybersecurity plan as opposed to a silo by itself. Next one. Final one, I think, before Andy starts shouting at me, is to make sure you future-proof any of your backup and DR plans, okay? I know a lot of you 3 years ago, if you're reviewing your backup and DR right now, probably weren't in the cloud back then, and you might be in the cloud right now. So you need to be ensuring that any plans that you make in the next year, the next 12 months, even the next few months, when you're investing in a backup technology, ask the vendor, how is this future-proof? How is this going to help me with scalability? I'm going to ingest a huge load of data in the next 12 months. How is that going to address that problem? Immutability is huge. I don't need it right now, but I might need it in 12 months. How do you address that concern? Ask probing questions. You need to invest in something that is going to be right for you and your school's future. Okay? And that's me, I believe. I think I've hit the right time. Did I do it?
That was good. Well, near enough.
Slightly over.
Near enough. I kind of didn't press start on the timer at the beginning. So.
I'm taking it.
Yeah, take it. You've done it. There's an awful lot of terminology being thrown at us there, Poppy. We had a few questions pop into the Q&A. You'll be pleased to know, so we'll tackle those later.
Fabulous.
Thank you. They'll give you a chance to get your breath back and deal with the immutability of life. Or something like that. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to run through some of that backup top tips. And they're really, really good tips. I think what's nice about that particular piece there is that some of it's really easy to achieve. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. And it does provide you with really good levels of resilience against certain attacks. It's not going to get all the attacks all of the time, but again, what I talked about in my presentation was that layering, and by doing lots of different things, then we begin to make it harder and harder for cyber criminals to successfully attack our systems and gain access to our core or critical data. You know, there's that age-old analogy, isn't there, about when you're talking about home security. Keeping yourself secure at your house. What you want to do is make your house less attractive to burglars than the next door's house, which is always a terrible thing to say, saying you want to push the criminals to your next door neighbours. But that's essentially what you're trying to do here. You know, what you're trying to do is reduce the risk to its lowest possible level and make yourself as unattractive to cyber criminals as another site. And that way they're more likely to target the other site because they can see a way in and they gain access to the data that way. So by layering up, by doing lots of different things, you make yourself less attractive. And that's a good thing in this situation. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by a very good colleague of mine, Arshid Bashir, who is Head of Cybersecurity for the Department for Education, who is going to run across an imminently soon-to-be released, brand new, never-before-done supportive tool for schools in England. Arshid, are you there?
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really happy to be here. So really pleased to participate in this. So as Andrew mentioned, we've been having in planning for a while the requirement that we push out a self-assessment tool for schools to use as a basis for them to start understanding the level of cyber risk that they may have, or the maturity of the cyber resilience that they actually have in their organisation. And the intention behind this tool is this is, for us, it's helping schools to go on the journey to understand where they need to be in time, as opposed to where they may be just now. And of course, with 24,000 schools, everybody's at a different point in that journey and maturity that we've had. Just to put some context in the year to August, there were 80 incidents that affected 200 establishments that were all ransomware. So significant, and this is in schools. I spent better part of yesterday evening dealing with a ransomware attack on one of the universities in the Northeast, another university in the Northeast. So it's been obviously a challenging piece. And whilst we've been going through the last 2 years of lots of increasing ransomware attacks, we clearly are pointing towards a tooling which provides a capability for schools and school leaderships to articulate what their state of cybersecurity may or may not be, and incrementally look to improve it, both at a technology area, but also in a risk aspect as well. So one of the disconnects we find is there are huge gaps between governors understanding, school leaders understanding, and then the technology providers understanding of what the cybersecurity ask is, and it covers all of that. So we have necessarily started from what we think is a bottom rung. This will be free to schools to use. Southwest Grid for Learning are our partner. They will be delivering this service, and we will be keeping a watching brief to see what comes back from it. One of the things I think schools aren't aware of is that the department actually has a cyber information security unit, and we respond to and deal with cyber incidents in schools. So we do have direct contacts. We are available for some advice and guidance. We will signpost to NCSC as well. We work very closely with NCSC. But we see this as a mechanism by which we can have further outreach. From a departmental view, our intention in the tool is to provide something to schools as opposed to have too much intrusive access to what schools are doing. So from that point of view, all the data that you put into the tool is anonymous to us. We only look at the aggregated picture, and the aggregated picture will provide us where the gaps are and what interventions we as a department need to do in cybersecurity to support schools. So there's a great question in the Q&As, and I know it's not the Q&A piece, but there's a great question about, will the department provide cloud backups at a discount or free? Colleagues in the digital strategy division within the department are working on what the technology offer will be back to schools going forward, including all the digitalization of higher speed broadband, servers and cloud platforms. So there will be things coming out. Just to pick back on the previous speaker's comments about cloud backups are not a silver bullet in themselves. So if you're going to go down cloud backups, please bear in mind you must have stuff, you will have stuff that's hot standby. That's great. But you must also have stuff in cold store, because what you don't want to do is have your backup that's hot standby having been compromised and not being able to revert to other backups. And there's a whole conversation about multi-generational backups as well. So there will be stuff coming from the cloud side that will be offered to schools. But from a cybersecurity specialist standpoint, it is not a silver bullet. And I think somewhere previously somebody talked about, should we move to cloud? Yeah, absolutely. Cloud is really good. It can be far more secure, but out of the box, it's not secure. So just like any server or any PC you buy, when you get it out of the box, it's not secure. You have to secure it. So, and as part of that journey, as we look at the cybersecurity tooling that we're offering, the most important thing I think is it'll give you an outcome of what your position is. That's for you to use. It'll give you signposting to what you need to do next to improve that position. And then over time, we will add to that tool to give you more and more granular information that you as schools actually can consume and use for yourself and use to report back the risk to governors and leaders. And I absolutely get, I know colleagues from Bitdefender and obviously Phoenix have talked a lot about it's quite easy to do. And for me, my point of view being immersed in this is quite easy to, but I do absolutely understand it isn't easy for schools and teachers to absorb the subject matter, especially when your time is really constrained. You've got tight budgets, you've got really tight constraints and deliverables and timelines to achieve. So the tooling has been designed from a standpoint that you can do a little bit, leave it alone, come back, do a little bit more, come back, and over time build up that picture. Now, we know some of our pilot schools have gone through the whole thing, and most of the feedback from the 50 schools I've been piloting has been very positive. That it's fairly intuitive. It's not perfect, but it's fairly intuitive. They can rattle through it quite quickly. But once you've actually put down the base data, all you need to do is over time maintain it. And I think that's kind of the message that I would like to push over, that this is about your value and understanding what your cyber resilience level is and the risk that you hold and what you need to do next, and how we as a department can over time start supporting you in improving that understanding and, most importantly, delivering you practical, tried, tested, actionable resources. So not grand schemes and the grand policies that you think, well, I've got an on-premises system, how do I do this? We will give you over time the how-tos as well. I'll stop at that because I'm conscious that I could overrun and dominate the whole conversation and talk about cybersecurity forever. So I'll pause.
Asha, do you want to take the next couple of minutes to just flick through some of the screenshots from CyberSecure?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I've got a couple of minutes left for you there. So, Andy, if you want to move on the slides. Oh, Andy's got a tech problem. There we go. Click again. There we are.
Okay, so these are just some screenshots about the look and feel of it. Hopefully what you'll see is fairly straightforward, fairly accessible. We spent an inordinate amount of time distilling down what were highly technical questions into a language which we think teaching and teachers and schools can actually access and absorb as well. So it's a self-assessment tool. Flipping on to the next page. That's a spider diagram. So once you go through the 23 sections, put in all the questions, we use a 1 to 5 point maturity scale on this. And our suggestion at this point, 1 being you're really immature in what you're doing in cybersecurity and your resilience level, 5 being you're superstars, you're way better than you possibly need to be. We're initially suggesting that the target for most areas, and it doesn't have to be in every single area, is around about 3. And you can map out where we think you should be or what your comparisons to other peer groups might be and where your school is as well. So you know where you might actually have the gap, that you may need to spend a little bit more time and effort and focus and resource to move up that piece. What we're hoping over time is we will give you a set of peer groups that you can do benchmarking against, be it, say, another primary or another multi-academy trust, or could it be regional? So you actually have a baseline to say, how are we comparing to others? And of course, that information will always be confidential and anonymous because we won't declare to you what those other schools are. So I think that's probably I think this is one of the outputs which have immense value in leading to sets of conversations about what the next steps are and what you need to do. Okay, Thank you. And again, in a more detailed level, as you review, we talk about people, system, organization, processes, technology. Again, we give you what we think are your the scoring that you have, and where you are on that against that scoring. So, you know, you can work through the system and understand the gaps you've left, and then come back and revisit them and see where you are. So this is bite-sized chunks for you to take on board, understand, and move on. Again, I emphasize, we recognize your time is really precious, and this consumes a lot of it. Of course, if you have IT providers, they should be helping you and supporting you in this, but bear in mind that this is primarily aimed for the understanding of school leadership and governance as well. Okay, thank you. A lot of detail, that's just, well, thanks, Andy, you've zoomed in, perfect. So we've got the level 1 to 5s. We've shown where some of them might be at, for example, level 2. And to move to level 3, what do you need to do to achieve that? Now, bear in mind, this is a starting point. We will enhance this over time. We will build on what we're starting out with. But we think these are signposting to what practical, actionable steps you can take to get to a better place. And
thanks, Arshid. I'm not sure if you're going to end there, but that was a perfect ending.
Yeah.
Practical, actionable steps I really like. And it's really good just to have that opportunity to look into the tool there, Arshid. I am conscious of time slots, and you've done a lovely piece of work. They're great to hear some of the challenges that you're experiencing at the DFE in terms of supporting schools with some of the crises that they're encountering from a cyber threat perspective. So thanks for taking us through that and spending the time today. We know we'll come back to you, and I know that we can all see that us who are presenters, that there's some questions in the chat and the Q&A which we will unpick in due course. But it does give me great pleasure to introduce, I suppose, good colleagues and friends of mine as well. This would be Andy and Jez, who I've known for a number of years now, and come to us today with their CySec Aware hats on to give us an exploration around recovering from a cyber incident in school. Now, one of the things that Andy and Jez have done in the past on regular occasions is support schools who've encountered issues, much like Arshid was just outlining the DFE do, but they do it with a different perspective, and they have this real fantastic hands-on, experience-based approach that they can offer support and ideas in this little slot. And if you want them, you can come to the Southwest Grid website and book them directly, and they'll come out and work with you. Jez, over to you.
Excellent, Andrew. Thank you very much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you. And again, I understand how difficult giving up time to these kind of events are. But you've had an awful lot of good information. Your heads might be spinning. It's all been very, very positive. We've been put on at the sort of twilight shift, really, to give you a real experience. I mean, my background is 30 years as a police officer. I've also worked longer as a civilian member of law enforcement and continue to have access into that environment. What I'm going to talk to you about, and then what my colleague Andy is going to take over from me and sort of finish up about, is a real incident that we attended as law enforcement in a school. And this is how it rolls out. So Andy, if you don't mind flicking over, please. So what would you do if you're having, and in this case, it was a rainy Wednesday morning, in November, and the police knock on your door at school. In this case, it was a very large secondary school. And we said, Andy? And again, flick through, thank you. Your school is in, oh no, sorry, back one, that was my mistake. Your school is infected with a Trojan. How do we know? Well, there's an awful lot of high-level covert work being done by very many government agencies and trusted third parties that give us information that we have to act upon. And in this case, we were told this school had been infected with a Trojan. For those that don't understand or don't know, a Trojan is basically some malicious software that has got onto your school network, and they can have a lot of different objectives. They could be looking to steal your data. They could be looking for part of a ransomware attack. They could be looking just to lock you up completely. In this case, this was a backdoor to allow the baddies, the organised crime group that was responsible for this, to steal data off the wires in a live manner. That's how good this piece of software was. If we can roll on, please, Andy. And again, that's it. Lovely. So our major concern, and the reason that we were brought in fast time and it was a law enforcement response, was because we had huge concerns that safeguarding data may have been compromised. There are many different systems that you use out there, but it was predominantly your child protection data. So as a senior leadership team, you were presented with this set of facts, and it was the likes of me, well, it was me saying, I don't know what you have planned for today, but we're going to ask you to go dark. We're going to pull you out the wall, because apart from the general data protection principle data breach you may have suffered, the particular nature of the data was of real concern. Safeguarding data of vulnerable children, unfortunately, has massive currency to a certain part of the population on the darker, deeper, nastier parts of the web. And that was our biggest issue. So we said, here you go, this has happened, we need to pull you out of the wall. On one, please, Andy. And again, so senior leadership team, who were fantastic, despite the fact they were having heart palpitations, they rang their IT support, which in this case was third party provided. And again, please, Andy. And yeah, thank you. Now, there is some very, very good third party IT support out there, but unfortunately, this wasn't one of those. And we have seen this, I have seen this time and time again in the education environment for lots and lots of reasons, that you end up with poor IT support. And one of the big things, I mean, Andy is going to take over towards the end and talk about points to learn. But one of the big things here is I implore you, if you've got third-party IT support, just make sure you understand what you've signed up for, and that they will do what you think you want them to do when the worst happens. As in, law enforcement walks through the door and says, you're going dark. So, IT support did not have a clue. They didn't know what the impact would be on the school of switching off the network, and they had no idea how to respond. They couldn't isolate anything. So Andy, if we can roll on, please. And again, we can flick through this bit. Ideas, none. Yeah, there we go. And yeah, excellent. So we said to the senior leadership team, we're going to pull you out of the wall. What do you need as the minimum to carry on functioning as a school? And you, ladies and gentlemen, will understand that far better than I. But the problem is they had to close because the IT support could not lock down certain systems. So they lost everything. They couldn't say, well, hang on, we can isolate this, we can isolate that. They just turned everything off because that's how inept they were. And I use that strong word on purpose. So the school had to close because of all of those reasons and more. On again, please, Andy. Now, law enforcement fortunately have access to some really clever people, and they came in and did all of that digital forensics analysis. We exfilled all the data that was needed to start a criminal investigation. One of the things they found out is that the baddies had been sat on that network for 5 months and nobody knew. And again, please, Andy. And the problem was, what we found after we'd left, is that IT started to rebuild, and click again, please, Andy, a couple more times. And the school was in this circle of doom. IT rebuild, infection, IT rebuild, infection, and round they went for 5 days. And again, please, Andy, and again. Well, a week later, the school was able to open, which was good. It was not in a good place. It really, really wasn't. And although we were there to support victims, and we really felt so sorry for this particular school because of the nature of their IT support, they had really used up their law enforcement tokens. But they opened up a week later. And again, And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Andy.
Thanks very much, Jez. Thanks for joining us, everybody. So I have the pleasure of the next part of the act. So far, pretty doom and gloom for the school, but they've got open again. But next slide, please. A couple of months later, we are back through the door again to say it's back. This infection is on your systems again, and it looks horribly like things are going wrong. Next slide, please. We do some work. We do some more in-depth work than before because things clearly aren't going that well. One of the worrying things that we uncovered was that actually there was an awful lot of data moving about that shouldn't have been. You know, there was a lot of insight into what was flowing over the boundaries from a safeguarding perspective, looking for keywords that might indicate children and young people are at risk, but they weren't aware of the fact that some children, for example, were sending gigabytes of data out of the school. Now, why was that? No idea or insight. Next slide, please. But what we found after an awful lot of hard work was that this was the culprit. A very innocuous looking piece of kit. It was a payment top-up machine for the lunch cards for the students in the school. And it turns out, doesn't look like it, but this was a Windows XP computer. It hadn't received an update in years. And the main reason was it was an asset that belonged to a third party, the catering company. It was on the network, but nobody had responsibility for it. Next slide, please. The lessons you can learn from this. This was just one example of many in us supporting schools when things have gone horribly wrong. And there are many lessons to be learned. And that's what we've incorporated into the kind of training that we can offer you. Next slide, please. One of the key things that we want you to take away from this is that cybersecurity is not just about IT. You know, it's really easy to hand this parcel over to your IT provider, your IT team in school and say, here you go, here's the problem. But actually, this is a risk management problem. And that's something you as school leaderships are generally pretty excellent at. You know, you understand and you know how to manage the risks in the real world around young people doing things that maybe they shouldn't do, and school trips and risk assessing. And this is no different. You have technical people on call, on tap in your IT teams, your IT provider to guide you in this world. But you need to know as leaders what questions to ask. How do you build in the security into that framework? Arshid has just presented you with a fantastic tool, which is that framework you can build upon, but you need to understand enough to start going down that journey. You need to own these risks at senior leadership function. You need to understand the equipment, the assets within your network and how to keep them secure and safe. Things like understanding that all of the assets must be owned, must be kept up to date. And a key thing here, you know, the school leadership in that example were fantastic in how they supported us, but they'd never planned for a cyber attack. They'd never planned for a cyber incident, which may well be wider. But a plan will reduce those response times and minimize the impact on your school and the safeguarding elements that cascade out of that. Now, one of the key things is you need to learn. The leaders need to learn, the staff need to learn. And that's why we've tried to make this an interesting function. Learn by doing, learn by playing a game to learn about cybersecurity. But importantly, focus on what you need to understand and what your staff need to understand. And from a staff perspective, a lot of them find this really challenging. You know, they might do a big sigh when they're told they're doing cybersecurity training. Make it interesting, make it fun, and make it personal. They will invest in this if it is personal for their own lives. Back to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Andy and Jez, yeah, absolute stars, bringing that in at just under 10 minutes, no less. Well done, gentlemen, and thank you very much for that. It's really interesting to hear from people who have gone in to respond to incidents, because it's by doing, as Andy's just saying there, that you do that learning, you know, going and exploring these things and going and testing out scenarios and situations really does help you understand what you might do, what the impact might be, and the learning that you can get from those particular situations. Now, Andy, I'll give you a little break. What we're going to try and do for this next section, my Andy, is that we've got a whole Q&A little section, and I'm really delighted to see lots of lovely questions that have come into our Q&A function. And we haven't published any of those, but I can promise that they are all here, and we'll publish them as we go through them. And what we're going to try and do is just going to be a bit flexible with this section, I suppose. We're working within the constraints of this particular video conferencing platform, which means only one of us can be visible on video at any one time. But all my panel members, everybody who's been presenting today, can now unmute at will, and we'll bring them in on video as they're talking, which may mean there's a slight delay between you hearing them and you actually seeing them. But I hope that won't detract too much from the value of what they're trying to say and how they're going to respond to these questions. I think what's quite nice is I've taken sort of vaguely in a chronological order, just to be fair to those people who asked questions early on, is that the first one's really, I guess, a panel question, and anybody who's got any suggestions about how schools can share personal experiences of a cyber attack in schools for others to learn from it. So does anybody have a suggestion they'd like to present back to the asker of that question? Go on, Danny.
I'd like to actually, Andrew. I don't think it's specific. My response here isn't going to be specific to schools or education. I think it's just something in general that we need to think about. And I always use the British Airways example from 2018 when they were hacked. There's still a stigma associated with cyber attacks, and if you think about how the NCSC was set up to share experiences, and we can only learn from experiences, and it goes back to what we were saying. Anyone can be hacked. It can happen to anyone, and it can and will at some point happen to a lot of businesses. We need to remove the stigma away from being attacked and being a victim of a cyber attack. And that's the important thing there, the victim of a cyber attack. Whenever you see reports of a big corporation or organization being hacked or cyber attacked, the tendency tends to be to finger point at them and blame. We don't do that when people are burgled. We don't do that when banks are robbed. They are the victims, right? They're victims of criminals, and therefore we learn from that, and we prosecute and go after the criminals, as opposed to pointing the finger at the victims. And I think that. So I think the more we can, going back to the original question. Sorry, I deviate. The more we can remove the stigma, the more people will be willing to share experiences, and the more we can learn from it, if that makes sense.
No, it really does. I know Arshid's unmuted. I'll come to you just a second, Arshid. It is that you're right. I think we had a couple of experiences that we've supported schools with. One in particular stood out because they completely took ownership of broadcasting their incident and their responses and their experiences to people. And they went, you know what, this has happened and this is what we've learned. And I thought that was really, really powerful and effectively brave of them, Arshid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add a little bit, and this is my direct experience. So in principle, we find most schools are quite open and happy to start sharing information stories. Some have certainly expressed the requirement for a degree of anonymity, and certainly other schools have been very public. But one of the barriers we find, and it's a challenge that we're working on, is schools that have insurance where cyber insurance is invoked. The insurance company basically shuts down all conversations and information sharing. And we think that's a barrier to understanding and where we need to achieve. We are hoping that over time, through the self-assessment tool, we will start doing write-ups and sharing of experiences that people have had. We're certainly aware of some schools that are willing to do that. And I think that'll be a useful mechanism by which they can do that. I think the other piece is we would like to encourage, again, we're not being kind of prescriptive about this. It's more a kind of a thought out there. We would like to encourage a degree of clustering of schools around the self-assessment tool to learn from each other, and that might offer opportunities by which we can set up suitable networks that actually are supportive of each other, but then can also do information sharing and controls and security countermeasure sharing as well.
Brilliant. I really love the idea of that, getting a bit of sharing of intelligence. Anybody else got any thoughts they want to add before I move on to the next question?
Just a very quick one, Andrew. Just a thought on CISP. There is the Cyber Information Sharing Portal from National Cybersecurity Centre. There are various different kind of sub-forums on that platform. Great place to share if you're willing. And of course, you've also got police cyber protect teams. So I'm sure across the country they exist. They would be happy to hear from schools who might want to share their experience, maybe anonymously, to help others learn.
Thanks, Andy. Good intel. Okay, I'm going to direct this next question towards Poppy. You knew this was coming, Poppy. You can pick this one up. What about cloud environments? This Keith here just asking about OneDrive and Google Drive, and of course API hacking and how we might protect using backups there, perhaps.
Okay, so this is a very broad question, so I'm going to answer this as concisely as I can, because cloud workloads is a very broad workload, if you like. So I'm going to operate on the assumption that you have nothing on premise whatsoever. Everything you have is in the cloud. And I think when I saw this question come in, it's when I mentioned offline backups. Now, I mentioned specifically the cloud on the premise that the majority of schools still have something on premise. So the natural next step for offline would have been the cloud. You still absolutely have options for offline if you are 100% cloud. That could be another cloud provider, that could be backing up to AWS if you like, if you're in Azure, or the other way around if you're the other way around. You could use a third party, so a management company. Now, I know historically that's come with quite a hefty price tag. Phoenix work with partners, and like the SWGfL, we work with partners that are catered towards your model, so they're a lot more cost effective, and that removes some of the labour and indeed concern that comes with having to manage and find resource to do that yourselves. Things like Office 365, again, I'm having to ramble on quite quickly because cloud workloads is quite a broad subject. Office 365, Google Workspace, they operate on a shared responsibility model. Now, that's great for the cloud service providers, not so great for you guys, because it means that there is an onus on you to protect your data. So what we'll take Office 365 for an example. Microsoft will always guarantee the uptime of their service, so their responsibility in this shared model is ensuring that you can access Office 365, that it's working as it should be, that you can essentially, what you're paying for, you're getting. Your side of the responsibility, arguably the most important one, is your data. So anything you put into Office 365 or Google is your responsibility. The backing up of that does not fall to Microsoft. I know in the past there's been a lot of speculation about what retention policies can do. Can you use things like litigation hold? And I really need to stress to you that they are not a backup. That is not a secondary copy of your data. That is just retaining the original data source. If that gets infected with malware, you're just keeping the same thing around. You're not getting rid of it. You're not overwriting it. You're not rolling back to a single point in time. You're just allowing that same piece of information to stay. So you really do need to consider a backup for 365 or Google workloads or anything that works on a shared responsibility model.
Yeah, if I can just jump in very quickly on what Poppy's just said. From a cybersecurity perspective, it's very important to differentiate between security of the cloud, which is what the cloud providers do. They secure the cloud environment compared to security in the cloud. That's still your environment. You're still responsible for your own data and what goes on inside your own environment.
Absolutely, he's 100% right. So I know it's daunting to think that you may have been led to believe that that was your that was their responsibility, but it isn't. And I assure you, if you were to be hit with a phishing attack and they were to encrypt your OneDrive or your SharePoint, and you're relying on retention periods, long retention periods to hold all of that data, you're going to have a very large task on your hands. A third-party tool, some of them can be cheap as chips, if you like. You're not going to have to remortgage your house, is what I'm saying. They will allow you that peace of mind, a very quicker RTO and RPO, and you essentially don't have to worry about it as much as you would do if you didn't have anything in place. Azure workloads, AWS workloads, anything where you've got servers in the cloud, VMs, anything like that is a little bit more complex. don't want to recommend product if I can avoid it, just because everybody's data is different, but I would encourage you to reach out through Andrew to myself, and I'm more than happy to have an individual conversation based on what your environment looks like, and we can tailor some recommendations based on that. I'm free all the time to you guys, aside from after January because I'm having a baby, but the person who's coming in after me will be more than happy to help.
Great. That's a really, really good conversation, you two. Thanks ever so much for that. And I think it just makes clear, and I think it's one of the things that's come through across lots of the work this afternoon, is that from a senior leadership perspective, it's time to take ownership of this environment. It's time to step out of that accepting that IT are going to fix it and start taking that this is a risk assessment approach. Now, one of the things that I didn't say that I've said before in the past is that this is exactly the same as if you're going on a school trip. You know, if you're going on a school trip, you spend time assessing what the risks of taking the kids to the river might be, and what might the worst case scenario be, and how you might mitigate against that worst case scenario. This is no different to that, with the exception that what you're talking about is information. And yes, there are confusing terms, and that's one of the reasons, and Arshid will nod sagely at this, that we've spent time in the Cyber Secure tool making sure there's a glossary of terms that pops up to give you the intel you need to understand and decode Poppy, Danny, Arshid, Andy and Jez's and my language in this environment. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus a question towards Virginia, if I may. And this might spill out into others of us in the panel as well. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening, Virginia, is in your, and this will be your opinion, and perhaps you can't answer this, hence why I'm opening to the panel. But is there a benefit in starting early or continuing cyber skills education till 18? Do you think there's any benefit to doing this, start at 4 or go to 18?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In my opinion, yeah, there is. So the children, as we have seen, they are starting to get acquainted with the online world and doing stuff and connecting with people and communicating and being exposed to all sorts of risks. So they need to be empowered to understand and kind of take a step back into thinking about, before posting things online and etc., what they are doing, what they are actually, what might be the consequence on that. But not only in terms of so this is one side of the coin, the online safety kind of empower children to be safer, right? But there is the other side of the coin, in my opinion, which is the actual empowering the capacity of children to think about the privacy and security of the data, so passwords and not sharing passwords and how this password works and things that they can actually do. So really concepts that they can do that leads to cybersecurity on the technical side, or in terms of not only using tools, but how they work, how the internet works, how you communicate online, and things that goes behind the scene, right? For their lives and the future, not only their safety, but how things work, to understand, to ring a bell on their heads about, but why do I need to do that? Nothing is going to happen, etc. That's fine. But if they understand some things behind it, they will, and then this will improve and go deeper as they move along up to 18. These are my thoughts.
That's great, Virginia. I really appreciate that. Danny, I can see you're unmuted. Is that intentional to jump in on that?
No, I didn't realise I was muted, to be honest. But right. I think now you've got me. No, I'd agree with that. I don't think there's any, you know, in the era we live in now, I don't think there's a young enough age to start with in terms of teaching young people how to use the internet securely. You know, it's here, it's how we operate. It's how they're going to operate in education. It's how they're going to operate when they move into the workplace. So teaching them how to use the internet securely and safely and look out for, you know, pitfalls and traps yeah, the more you ingrain that in people from a young age, just like we've done in the past with other things, and I'm not going to show my age and give references, but yeah, this is how young people grow up now. So you teach them from a very young age to use it safely and securely. I totally agree.
Right, I'm sitting here smiling for those of you who can't see me. Jez, you're unmuted as well. Do you want to have one last word on this?
Yeah, please, if I may. Another hat I've worn with law enforcement is the Cyber Choices strand of the whole program sent from the National Crime Agency, and that looks at and it is the flip side coin of what's been discussed here around sort of e-safety and young people using the internet and being encouraged to use the internet and digital and have a digital life, because regardless of what they do and where they end up, they're obviously going to be in this space more than any of us ever have been. But the Cyber Choices strand looks at young people getting into really poor behaviours in this space. Again, we're not talking about e-safety, we're talking about Computer Misuse Act offences. Because traditionally, and I am generalising, but it is based on an awful lot of experience, the adults around most young people are lost. And so they're not getting the boundaries and the guidance. We understand as parents, as carers, as professionals, you know, we can tell young people, don't take a weapon to school, don't take drugs, don't do this. We understand all of that. But what we don't understand is young people using their influences of choice, which are invariably online, and they are committing offences against the Computer Misuse Act, often for fun. It's a hobby. It's interesting. They get kudos, they get peer appreciation. And before we know what they do, they've been groomed and end up potentially acting on behalf of an organised crime unit. And again, this is organised crime in general, just a slightly different flavour. So that's something else. The more we can get in, the earlier we can get in with young people and explain the whole gamut of their cyber life, their digital life, then the better we can protect them 360 degrees.
Thanks, Jez. Really interesting to see it here and see a different perspective on young people's education. And that insider threat that I mentioned in my slot is not just from staff members inappropriately sharing data or using weak passwords. It's also from the pupils at the school who are inside the system looking to exploit the system to say gain kudos or to share information or to hide certain behavior styles. A few more questions if I might. Actually, these are going to come your way. But I was really pleased to see we must have one of our contributors on the call this afternoon, the session, who's the first time they've seen Cyber Secure constructed, and they say that it looks great, and they just reiterated the amount of time that we took to get the language right. So we hope that the language goes down well for those of you when you get access to it. But in regards to access, is there a link around for this Cyber Secure toolkit yet? Arshid, I know the answer to this, but you answer it.
You know the answer to that. So we've ran the first pilot for 50 schools. We're looking at the next tranche. Surprisingly for us, and actually very welcoming for us, was when we announced the pilot, we got over 100, I think it was 125, 150 schools within literally a couple of days saying we want to be part of the pilot. So we're hoping that there will be a link, but we're not making it widely available at this stage. We're going through another tranche of pilots because we want to get this right. And even when we launch, we recognise this is ongoing improvement work. So your feedback and your comments are really important. We're aiming, so the schools minister that was Nick Gibb had given a commitment that we'd launch the tool in the first quarter of next calendar year. So that would be January. We're actually hoping we might actually do it earlier than that. But look out for the links that will come your way and the emails and announcements prior to that when we actually release the tool for wider use. You can actually email us, specifically the department, and we will then send you out links if you so want. So the general email address for the department, anything to do with cybersecurity, it could be comments, could be questions, could be just we need some help or pointers or signposting, is sector security inquiries at education.gov.uk. So not a plug, but we are available as a team. And we're happy to take on board people expressing interest or any questions. But I'm sure Andrew and SWGfL will circulate both our email address and also the link to the tool once it's available.
Of course, Arshid. What we'll do is if you stick that into the chat window between us presenters, one of the team will then share that email address as well publicly through the Teams call that we're in now, which is great. And I think that answers the other question regarding the LEA pilot programme and that we also had in. We're talking about grants for smaller schools as well, Arshid. Sorry to put you on the spot another time. We'll do another panel one in just a minute.
Yeah, really. So I'm afraid I'm going to kind of back out of that question because grants and funding are not in my purview at all. I know the general position has been that we expect schools to manage within the funding levels that they have within risk management. However, if you happen to be on something like the RPA scheme, there are additional grants and funds being made available, and there are options, as have been pointed out, where the costs may not be prohibitive. So some of the options are quite cheap, quite easy to do in mitigating risk. And we're very conscious of the fact that some smaller schools, certainly smaller primaries, don't have the access to technology providers and people and to get this done. But we're happy to listen and help where we can, or signpost to other parts of the department or division that may be able to assist.
Great, thanks, Arshid. And that, to some extent, starts to talk about this next question we've got floating in our list of questions around the lack of investment in IT equipment. So a panel question. As big pain for school IT teams expected to support kit that's nearly a decade old and the security risks alongside that. So perhaps somebody other than Arshid wants to pick that one up first. Oh, deadly silence from the team. Come on, panel.
I can pick up from a backup and DR perspective, if you like, because it's not uncommon to see decade-old kit being used as backup targets. As long as your kit is still in support and it's not over capacity, you can still use it. The age of it isn't going to impact the actual resiliency of the kit itself physically. It can still be used as a backup target or a DR site on a second site if that's what your concern is. You don't need top of the range switches, server stands to be able to do that. Although somebody from a wider cybersecurity point of view might want to pick up on the security risks of sweating old kit. But from a backup DR point of view, if that's your concern, I mean, you can reach out to us if you'd like us to help with that requirement, but sweating old kit out isn't going to impact as long as it's still actually working and it's in support.
And I think you said a couple of interesting things there, really. Maybe I'll pick up on this one for give you all a rest. You've been working very hard this afternoon. I've been sitting here pretty. But you know, in the long-term perspective on IT investment within schools has been a challenge for a number of years. I remember as a local authority and regional consortium advisor back in 2012 talking this exact situation is what's the cycle, what's the ROI cycle, how often are you going to invest in equipment in order to continue to ensure that your estate, that means that the devices in your school network, are maintained and up to date, and as Poppy's just said, they're still supported. That support means that there are security patches being released for that product, which means they're less open to attack. And that kind of leads us into another question that we've got floating here, which is around IT stuff. Go on, Danny. Go on, you can pick up on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's another angle to this. I agree with what Poppy's saying. I agree with what you're saying to a degree. The age of the kit, the age of the equipment isn't necessarily a problem, providing it's patched and it's updated and all those good things. It just depends on what kind of cybersecurity monitoring you've got in place, and for example, you know, if you have something like Bitdefender or CrowdStrike or any other provider, you need to ensure that operating system is supported by the vendor, that can, you know, that they can actually do the monitoring, detection, and response on that equipment, because it's not just about being supported from an IT perspective, it's from a security perspective as well. And to use an example, and I'll wrap this up quickly, but that's how elements of the NHS got caught out with the WannaCry attack.
That's a really good way of exemplifying things, Danny. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. Old kit doesn't necessarily mean a problem, but I think that the bigger question and the bigger piece of work here is how senior leaders within school organisations plan that cycle of investment. And from my experience, which may have changed because it's 9-10 years out of date, is that there wasn't necessarily a mid or long-term plan on turnover of kit and updating of equipment. And I think that's perhaps what the question is alluding to. And then and links to that, no IT staff on SLT teams, no sounding board, and no one listens to IT until it's too late. I feel your pain, Anonymous, who wrote that. What I'm going to do is, I'm just very conscious of time, and we're starting to run out of time. And what I've got is, I've got one lovely last juicy question for you all. And I want to go around one at a time, if I may, for all of you, and get best practice, best advice, whatever your reaction might be to what are 3 things that every school needs to start doing. Okay, so that's the question, is what are 3 things that every school needs to start doing? I'm going to go in the order I've got you on my screen. So I've got Andy and Jez, you can go first. Yeah, put you on the spot.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I'll keep it relatively simple for both of us, because there's some technical people here who will have technical thoughts around this. And what I would say was, there is of course a place for tech. Tech provides us with an awful lot of resilience and everything that we need in this environment, in the education environment, to keep the networks and the data safe. What I see on a daily basis, what Andy sees on a daily basis, is the victim data, the intelligence product, and we know that phishing still remains the #1 successful attack vector, and that poor passwords are also a massive point of weakness, whether that's getting into the network or getting into the cloud environments that have already been discussed at length. So what I would suggest is, because I'm guessing, and hopefully I'm not assuming too much and going to get it wrong, we're going to get to some technical solutions. I would say, empower your staff, empower yourselves as senior leaders. You don't need to be able to see the matrix and talk in binary, but you need to have a strategic view of what this all means for your school and your education establishment. And then that needs to be cascaded down to your staff. You're paying them anyway. So if you educate them, train them and empower them, they will be a massive part of your first line of defence. So I've probably covered 2 rather than 3 there, but the bottom line is, train yourselves, train your staff.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Poppy, what are you going to suggest as your 3 things that every school needs to start doing?
I'm going to start easy, and I'm going to reiterate the point I made on my top tips. The first one, and the most important one, and it's free, so you can't complain, guys, is to test your backup and your restores, please. For please, just if you take one thing away from it, is to be doing that, because it's really, really critical to ensure that your systems are working as they should be. Second one is to calculate your ATOs and RPOs, because that's going to help you understand where you have vulnerabilities when it comes to restoring in the event of an attack. I would work with somebody who can simulate an attack on you, so you work in real time, understand how critical that data is, how long it's going to take, what the business pains will be if it takes too long, or if you lose data along the way. And the third one, because it was quite topical within the question section, is to invest in a backup for Office 365 or Google. They are, as we said before, on a shared responsibility model. Your data is very, very vulnerable. These cyber criminals know that. They know that likely you don't have anything in place. And for those of you worried about budget, we can work with you to find a very cost-effective solution, I promise.
Ever the salesperson, sort of technical solutions provider. Love it. Virginia, what would you like to add to this? What are 3 things that every school needs to start doing, in your humble opinion?
Right. Okay. So I think that one thing is that we need to put security in the children's minds. So they have to start thinking about security for everything that they to understand that all around us and everything that they do, there is a security element to it. So using IoT, using social media, using this and that, all of this, they should be knowing that there are security consequences, there are security implications, etc. The other thing is that it's a human's part of the security, I think, not only the technical part in terms of children, right? So not only understanding how passwords work, but that they need not sharing the password, they need to keep the thing safe, etc. So, and the other thing that I think that is important is that, so the cybersecurity technical concepts and the safety, but from the perspective of so ethics and laws. So what is the consequence for you, but also for the others around you? So all the kind of implications and discussion around all the security topic as a holistic approach to, so classroom discussions and all that, thinking about which are the consequences of this kind of action, etc. I think that's
lovely, Virginia. Thank you. Really, three lovely things there to work on, and they're actually, again, no cost practical things that schools can start off with. Arshid, it's your turn next. Coming to you now. What are three things that every school needs to start doing?
So I'll be a little bit cheeky and say I've got 3.5 things to say. And I won't, and this is a security perspective, but I'll do it without being technical. So the first thing for me is understand your assets. If you don't understand your assets, you don't know what to secure or what's critical, or what's important. And the half bit to that is, if you have assets, make sure they're patched. That will save you enormous times of grief and effort in the long term. You may not see it. My second point would be, know and understand your access to those assets. Where is that access from? Who's accessing it? How are they using that? So whilst we touched on the most prevalent type of threat vector is phishing attacks, the second most prevalent vector that we've seen in education is remote desktop access. So just understand your access. And the third piece is, we've touched a lot about risk management. And the point I would say is, if you can't manage the risks, and it's not a one-time exercise, it's cyclical. You have to constantly review asset risks. If you can't understand and articulate and manage your risks, then you might be protecting the wrong things, investing your money in the wrong areas. And bear in mind that you as individuals are not necessarily the best risk assessors. Leverage what other resources you have, other people. There might be other teachers in other schools. There might be resources online. There might be your IT provider. But assess it. So everything we've talked about, be it backups, online, offline, cloud, remote access, these are constantly evolving and changing. The threat are changing. So your risk assessment has to be dynamic and cyclical. That's it.
Thank you very much, Arshid. I think that is a really key piece of advice. So that last piece, a tiny little thing you just mentioned there about using other resources, head teachers, SLTs, not being afraid to put their hand up and saying, I don't actually understand this very well, so I'm going to find somebody who does, and they can maybe help me out with this. Danny, you're going to be our last respondee to what are three things every school needs to start doing.
I'm going to cheat and have 5 things, but don't worry, it's not going to take too long. So, because it's an easy one for me. It's a cliche, but it's absolutely true. Focus on people, process, technology, and this comes from someone who runs a global operation, managed detection response, which is based on a very capable technology platform. But the most important thing is train your people, educate your people, bake your processes into your organizational strategy, and then just let the technology do its job. But yeah, people, process, technology. The other 2 things I want to quickly draw out there, just listening to the conversation, is We talk a lot about the IT team. I personally am big on differentiate the IT team from the security team. They're not the same things. They should work hand in hand. They should collaborate, but they're not the same things. Don't give security to the IT team, is what I would say. That's a trap that a lot of businesses and organizations fall into. And then finally, and very quickly, and I have to get this one in, be proactive. You know, it goes back to what I said before, proactive monitoring, the ability to detect something quickly that's gone beyond and just accept that something might get into the environment, but you're looking for it and you're going to catch it quickly and fix it rapidly. End of.
Thank you very much, Danny. Great ending piece of advice there that I hope really give our attendees, those of you who are sitting here watching us and listening to us, I hope this gives you some really practical things that you can go and start thinking about and get yourself doing even before cybersecure becomes available to you. It's been wonderful to have all of you here with me this afternoon, and I just want to thank all and every one of you for the time and effort spent in getting yourselves ready for this afternoon and being with me this afternoon. That's not only to all of our presenters here, Bitdefender, Department for Education, University of Kent, Phoenix Software and CySec Aware, and myself. We're really delighted that you've been able to spend some time with us, and we hope that you've learned a few things across the last couple of hours. This will all be available in due course. We'll make all the PowerPoint presentations available, as many links as we can possibly get together. We'll make available as well through that central event link hosted at swgfl.org.uk. That's us. So we've got in the middle there of our final slide just 3 things to do. We're in the centre there, swgfl.org.uk/security. Loads and loads of product resources, knowledge-based articles, magazine links and things that you can dig into there. NCSC has got loads of great advice. I've given you a short link there because it was just too long. It's under there in tiny little letters. If you want the actual link, tiny.cc/NCSC schools with a capital S is where you can go for that advice. And please complete our cyber survey. It's available at tiny.cc/CSS survey, or you can use the QR code that's on the screen now. If you complete that survey and you click through to add your details to the Google form at the end, we will then send you 5 free complimentary licenses for you to use Bitdefender software at home. One more time to everybody who is here today, thank you ever so much for spending time with us. Look at that, it is precisely 3 o'clock. Thank you for watching. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Cheers.
Bye.